The city's skyline glowed in streaks of copper and violet as dusk settled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. 15 years of building this company's financial backbone, and tonight the numbers on the glowing dashboard across my desk blurred into nothing more than static. My silk blouse clung lightly to my skin, still warm from the August heat, and the faint hiss of the air conditioner barely covered the distant hum of evening traffic. I replayed his words, as if my mind were a skipping record. Old school, unable to innovate. The new CEO, Ethan Cross, had delivered the verdict with the kind of casual cruelty only a man convinced of his own brilliance could summon. He was barely 40, all sharp suits and sharper ego, the type who believed disruption was a personality trait. I kept my face still during the meeting, my hands folded over the polished mahogany table, while inside my chest a storm coiled tight. The taste of my morning espresso lingered bitter at the back of my throat. 15 years as CFO, steering us through recessions and turnarounds, and this Boyking thought he could define me in a single sentence. My phone buzzed on the glass desk, a quiet vibration that felt louder than any shout. A message preview flashed, board meeting rescheduled. 8 a.m. tomorrow. Another move in his game. I smoothed an errant strand of hair behind my ear, a small, steady gesture. He thought I was finished. He had no idea how much of this company already bore my silent signature. The words, old school, dragged me back years, before Ethan Cross, before this glittering office, back to a kitchen that smelled faintly of burned coffee and ambition turned sour. I was 23 and clutching a worn leather portfolio like it was a lifeline. My father leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his construction boots tapping a slow, judgmental rhythm on the linoleum. Accounting, he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. That's not a career, Lauren. That's just pushing numbers around. You think you can build a life with that? Mom stirred a pot of chili without meeting my eyes. The wooden spoon clinked against the sides like a metronome of silence. I remember the lump swelling in my throat, the burn of unshed tears. I don't want just a life, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I want a career. I want control over my own future. Dad shook his head slowly, like I'd announced I was joining the circus. You'll come back home broke and disappointed. My fingers tightened on the portfolio, knuckles whitening. Inside it, tucked between spreadsheets and a scholarship letter, lay the object that kept me from breaking, my grandmother's old fountain pen. A smooth, black barrel with a tiny silver engraving, MM for Margaret Mitchell, the woman who raised my mother and whispered to me once, "Ink your own destiny, Lauren. Don't let anyone else write it for you." The pen's weight in my hand was a quiet rebellion, a promise I refused to let the room steal from me. That night, after the chili cooled and my parents retreated to their silent routines, I packed 2 suitcases. The portfolio went in last. The pen slid into the inner pocket of my blazer, close to my heart, where no one could touch it. I didn't slam the door. I closed it with the careful finality of someone who knows she won't be coming back until the world finally understands what she's worth. The first year away from home tasted like equal parts freedom and raw fear. My studio apartment in Chicago barely held a twin bed and a fold-out desk, and the radiator hissed like it had secrets of its own. At night, when the L trains rattled past, I'd sit cross-legged on the floor, running my grandmother's fountain pen over endless sheets of scratch paper, budget calculations, mock proposals, anything to keep my skills sharp and my courage sharper. Days blurred into long shifts at a mid-tier accounting firm. I started at the very bottom, an anonymous junior analyst buried under spreadsheets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and my chipped nail polish, steel gray to hide the ink stains, caught the glow whenever I typed until my wrists ached. There were nights I questioned everything. Nights when the whisper of my father's prophecy, "You'll come back home broke and disappointed," echoed in the drafty apartment. But the pen in my blazer pocket, a small press against my ribs, reminded me of my grandmother's words. Ink your own destiny. My first real break came in the unlikeliest form. Patricia Vance, a senior partner with a voice like warm bourbon and a wardrobe of unshakable confidence. She noticed the way I stayed late, recalculating client forecasts that weren't technically my responsibility. "You see patterns others don't," she said one evening, dropping a caramel candy on my desk as if sealing the observation with sweetness. "That's not old school. That's vision. Don't hide it." Patricia became my quiet mentor. She taught me the art of negotiation, how to lean forward in a boardroom just enough to command attention without seeming to beg for it, how to let silence stretch until the other side cracked first. Under her wing, I moved from junior analyst to senior strategist in 3 years. My first major win, a merger between 2 regional banks, brought me a bonus big enough to pay off student loans and trade the studio for a sunlit one-bedroom with actual space for a dining table. But I kept my success understated when I called home. Mom would ask if I was doing okay, and I'd answer with a modest, "I'm managing." I never mentioned the promotions, the late-night strategy sessions, the quiet thrill of seeing my name on million-dollar contracts. It wasn't about hiding out of spite. It was about building something that belonged entirely to me, something no one could diminish with a single dismissive sentence. Patricia's last piece of advice before she retired still rings clear. "Lauren, don't just climb their ladder. Build your own, and make it one they'll beg to stand on." I took those words and the old fountain pen and began sketching the blueprint of a career that would one day make men like Ethan Cross underestimate me at their own peril. By the time morning arrived, the city's glass towers were tinted pale gold. I stepped into the boardroom with a calm that felt almost foreign, the familiar weight of my grandmother's fountain pen clipped inside my blazer. Around the polished walnut table, the board members settled in, a dozen seasoned faces, each with their own quiet expectations. Ethan Cross stood at the head of the table, his charcoal suit cut too sharply, his grin a little too satisfied. He tapped a sleek tablet, bringing up a presentation that glowed across the wall. "As you all know," he began, his voice smooth as oiled steel, "our company must evolve to survive. Traditional finance methods," he flicked a glance my way, "are holding us back. To that end, I'm bringing in a new innovation team to reposition our strategy for the future." A ripple of murmurs stirred the room. I caught the faint scent of bergamot from my own coffee mug, steadying me. He continued, "Lauren Mitchell has served as CFO for 15 years, and we're grateful for her service. But going forward, that will be enough, Ethan." The words came from me, calm but carrying the unmistakable edge of authority. The room stilled. I slid a leather folder across the table toward the board chair. Inside lay documents stamped with the kind of power that made legal teams sweat, proof that over the past 5 years, through a quiet series of private equity moves, I had acquired a controlling stake, just over 51%, of the very company Ethan believed he commanded. The chair's brows lifted as he scanned the papers. A single, slow exhale passed around the table. Ethan's smirk faltered. This is some kind of stunt." "No," I said, leaning forward, so the light caught the silver engraving of the pen clipped to my blazer. "This is ownership. While you were busy posturing about innovation, I was building the future you can't even imagine. And as majority shareholder, I have called an immediate vote of confidence regarding the CEO position." Silence swelled, thick and electric. The board chair cleared his throat. "Given these documents and Ms. Mitchell's controlling interest, the motion stands." All in favor of her proposal. One by one, hands rose. A few hesitant at first, then certain. Ethan's face drained of color. The arrogance that had carried him into this room crumbled like dry plaster. I let the pause linger, a lesson in silence, just as Patricia once taught me. Finally, I said, "Innovation isn't a catchphrase, Ethan. It's foresight. It's building something that lasts. And that," I tapped the fountain pen against the folder's edge, "is not something you can import." A hush settled, broken only by the quiet shuffle of papers and the low city hum beyond the windows. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with the weight of a kingdom quietly changing hands. I let it breathe. When I finally spoke, my voice carried the steadiness of a gavel. "Here's how we move forward." I turned first to the board chair. "Effective immediately, Ethan will remain as CEO only on an interim basis, strictly to oversee the transition. But he will work under the directives I set forth as majority shareholder. A flicker of shock rippled across Ethan's face, quickly chased by something more fragile, doubt. I continued, letting each word land with measured grace. Condition 1. We will launch a mentorship and leadership track for women across every department, from entry-level analysts to senior management. Too many brilliant minds are overlooked because they don't fit someone else's narrow idea of innovation. The chair nodded slowly. Condition 2. Diversity will no longer be a bullet point on a slide. It will be written into the company's DNA, hiring, training, advancement. Real accountability, quarterly reports, and public metrics. I shifted my gaze back to Ethan. He tried to hold my eyes but failed. Condition 3. A permanent ethics committee to ensure that every project we greenlight reflects both our values and long-term sustainability. Profit without principle is a dead end. Someone at the far end of the table murmured an approving here. I softened my tone, but not my resolve. These aren't punishments. They're course corrections, changes that should have happened years ago. If we're going to claim innovation, let's earn the word. Ethan finally spoke, his voice stripped of bravado. And if I refuse? I uncapped the fountain pen, the nib catching a glint of morning light. Then you resign today, and I'll appoint someone who understands that leadership is more than a slogan. He exhaled, a quiet surrender. Understood. For the first time that morning, I allowed a small smile.
Good.
Because innovation isn't about age, Ethan. It's about vision. And mine just happens to be sharper than you expected. Patricia's last lesson echoed in my mind like a private applause. Build your own ladder, and make it one they'll beg to stand on. Weeks passed, and the company began to breathe differently, like someone had finally opened a window. The mentorship program filled overnight. The first training session buzzed with young analysts, women and men, leaning forward with the same eager fire I'd once carried in a cramped Chicago studio. The ethics committee drafted its first report with a clarity and conviction that made the boardroom feel new again. Ethan kept his interim title quietly. The swagger that once filled his every gesture was gone, replaced by something almost like humility. I watched him listen, really listen, during meetings. Change had a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges. One evening, long after most of the office lights had dimmed, I stood alone by the window of my corner office. The skyline shimmered against the indigo sky, a pattern of constellations carved by human ambition. In my hand rested the fountain pen, its silver engraving still crisp despite the years. I traced the initials with my thumb, remembering my grandmother's voice. Ink your own destiny, Lauren. Don't let anyone else write it for you. The words felt less like advice now and more like a lived truth. I had inked my own story, through doubt, through late nights, through every dismissal that tried to define me. I thought of my father's prediction, of the young woman who once left home with nothing but 2 suitcases and a stubborn belief in her own worth. She would not recognize this view, but she would recognize the resolve. Behind me, the city whispered in 1,000 tiny lights. I lifted the pen, feeling its familiar weight, and smiled. My story, I said softly to the empty room, has only just begun, and every line is mine to write.